Okay, so now it's right on time, 11 o'clock in Japan. Actually, I'm speaking from the United States of America, Palm Springs, the state of California, because of my commitment to this, APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. But anyway, okay, very nice to see you. And it's my honor and pleasure to invite speakers from New Zealand and Australia today. So our topic for today is, fairness. So basically, we are so much concerned about, positive psychology and also social fairness related issue. So at Chiba University, we have that kind of research project, which will be talked about briefly by our head of the project, Professor Jiro Mizushima, right after this. So today we have 2 hours, and then first we will soon be inviting Professor Arthur Grimes, Victoria University of Wellington. He's a professor and director and all these high-level positions he has been assuming. So his lecture title will be as indicated, Wellbeing and Public Policy, Challenges for a Post-COVID Fair Society. So soon after this, I will be hearing his lecture. And then after that, we wish to hear some discussions. We have invited Dr. Aaron Jarden of Melbourne University. He's a real expert on well-being in the social context, I believe. So he'll be making some comment. And then we also wish to invite our project leader, Professor Jiro Mizushima, as well as, sorry to say this, but Professor Masaya Kobayashi, who is being sick as of now. So if you could possibly do, that, discussion role to the extent possible, that would be appreciated. And then later on, we wish to have this question and answer session within this 2-hour time slot. Would that be all right? So, and then I'm willing to translate whatever is going to be talked about into Japanese, because the audience might be more comfortable reading the Japanese, summarization. So right after this, I wish to, stick to, typing in. So please bear with me. So now we wish to invite Professor Jiro Mizushima, our project leader, for his remark. So please, Professor Shima.
Oh, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. My name is Jiro Mizushima. Today, thank you for joining our online seminar. I'll make a few remarks as we open this seminar. Today, we are very happy that we have honorable guests from New Zealand and Australia who will kindly speak about well-being and public policy. I myself am a political scientist, and I am especially interested in the theme about well-being and public policy and politics. What can we do to increase the well-being, the life satisfaction by way of intervention of the government or civil society? This problem is quite acute because, as we know, we have all experienced the huge impact of COVID-19 these 3 years. In most cases, negative impact on the well-being of human beings. In that situation, we have to know what to do. What can we do to overcome this challenge? Today, I'm very excited that we have 2 famous experts on this field. I believe that this online symposium would make a great contribution to understanding of well-being and public policy, and it will promote our cooperation, international cooperation between Japan, Australia, New Zealand, And I see that we have also a participant from Mexico, from American continent. So this is truly a Pacific symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mizushima, for your opening remark. This main lecture session, which will be done by Professor Arthur Grimes. Okay, he's a professor of Wellbeing and Public Policy at the School of Government. Yeah, Victorian University of Wellington. Yeah.
Yep.
So we wish to invite Professor Arthur Grimes. So thank you so much for your time and talk with to talk to us. So you have about 30 minutes or so. A bit flexible, please. I wish to translate. So thank you very much. So over to you, please.
Okay, konnichiwa, and thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Ishido and Mizushima. It's wonderful to be here. This is a subject now that's growing all over the world, as we know. Just to let you know, I'm an economist by training, but I teach and work in a school of government. So I'm sort of very interested in thinking about how issues of well-being can be brought to public policy. And for that reason, one of the stresses that I'll put in, as you'll sort of detect through the discussion, is how we can use concepts of well-being for policy purposes, not just for academic purposes, but when we're actually trying to design policy, and especially if we're interested in, as you are, in issues of fairness, not just of average outcomes across society. So in terms of the talk, what I'll think about is the main outline is how can we think about well-being and fairness together, and how can we use those concepts to guide policy. I'll start off by noting, just after this, how well-being approaches to policy are not new. They have a very long history, back to antiquity and also over the last few centuries. And I'll follow that by discussing what do we mean when we talk about well-being. I'm a professor of well-being and public policy, but what do I mean when I'm talking about well-being, and what do some other people mean when they talk about well-being? Then I'll outline briefly two different well-being approaches that have been used in the policy arena, and each of those have also been used to incorporate fairness considerations. So there's sort of two main conceptual bases, I suppose, to thinking about well-being policy. I'll talk briefly about some country experiences, different countries that have used well-being oriented public policies. I'll talk about 6 different countries there based on a recent paper that I've published on that. And then I'll discuss some examples of using well-being as a guide for policy. So when we think about the history of well-being approaches, we can go back really about 2,500 years. I love this quote from Confucius around 500 BC. "There is good government when those who are near are made happy, and when those who are afar are attracted." In other words, governments should be can be judged if the people that live within their boundaries are happy, and whether other people who from outside their boundaries wish to move to that entity. It's a very nice summary, I think, although it doesn't necessarily include much about fairness. And at roughly the same time, a couple of hundred years later, on the other side of the world in ancient Greece, Epicurus's school motto was, "Here our highest good is pleasure." In other words, the idea that when people went to his school was that they should be enjoying themselves, they should be having pleasure, they should be happy, etc. So these are sort of similar ideas on other sides, different sides of the world 2,500 years ago. If we skip forward a couple of thousand years and we move to the period of the European Enlightenment, a very famous statement of the utilitarian view of the world was from the philosopher and economist lawyer Jeremy Bentham, so in 1776, saying it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So it's quite a similar concept to the Confucius quote, that when we're thinking about what a government is doing, whether it's working on policies that are right or wrong, are they making a large number of people happy? Again, it's not necessarily related to fairness in this case, because he's just thinking about really the averages across society. The person who did think about fairness at around the same time was Mary Wollstonecraft in England. All three of these were in England, who wrote, based on the same sorts of ideas, she wrote her great book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was saying that it's only fair that women should be treated with the same rights as men. And interestingly, Jeremy Bentham, I should have mentioned, actually used his approach to say that the happiness of all people in society was important, whether it was women or men. I think he included homosexuals and heterosexuals. He even extended it to people who believed in God or didn't believe in God, etc. So he was thinking about the whole society. And then a couple of generations later, John Stuart Mill, the great economist and philosopher, again had a similar idea. A moral agent should choose the action that maximizes the total happiness in the world. So again, he was talking about the role of government in this and other decision makers. So we have a sort of a period out of the European Enlightenment which really emphasized well-being. They tended to use the word happiness or utility at that time. And in the case of Bentham and Wollstonecraft in particular, the happiness of everyone in society. A different form of well-being, which is referred to by Aristotle back in the ancient Greek times, and more recently it's come to be known by the term eudaimonia, which is a term that Aristotle used, is sort of purpose in life. How a well-being might be summarized by our purpose in life. And this was very nicely summarized by Bobby Kennedy in the year that he was assassinated, in a speech to Kansas University, where he said, "Even if we act to erase material poverty, there is another greater task. It is to confront the poverty of satisfaction, of purpose and dignity that afflicts us all." So he was saying we shouldn't be just looking at material items when it comes to well-being or happiness, and nor were those other philosophers I quoted, but we should be thinking more deeply about what it is that makes life meaningful for all, that afflicts us all. So he wasn't just talking about a few, he was talking about all. So we have these slightly different notions of well-being, and they are all important when it comes to policy purposes. As an economist, I try and give some tighter definition when I'm talking about well-being, because I want to use the concept to be able to prioritize public policies. And for that purpose, I need to have a tighter definition of well-being than just a sort of very general idea that everyone, sort of a fluffy idea that everyone is happy. So if I look at the shorter Oxford Dictionary, English Dictionary, it defines the word well-being as the state of being or doing well in life, happy, healthy, or prosperous condition, or simply welfare. And it defines welfare as good fortune, happiness, or well-being. Now, the word welfare in economics has a long tradition going back at least as far as Arthur Pigou in 1920, so 100 years ago, if not before. He was the founder, really, of welfare economics. And he defined two different types of thinking about welfare. One was economic welfare, which looks just at sort of the material type things like wages and output and GDP, that sort of thing. But then he also defined total welfare as including all other things that make people's lives worthwhile. So his definition of total welfare would be very similar to the definition that we use today for well-being, how we feel overall about our lives. So this is not a new concept. Whether we use the word welfare or well-being, they basically mean the same thing. The word welfare has tended to drop out of usage in recent times only because Americans refer to people on social security benefits as being on welfare. So it's almost a pejorative term. When he won the Nobel Prize in 2016, Angus Deaton, great economist, summarized what he had done. He said, "I believe that my work has an underlying unity. It concerns well-being, what was once called welfare." So when I'm thinking about well-being, I'm thinking about what we've traditionally defined as welfare, which has always been defined in terms of the economist's notion of utility, our overall, how we rate our overall life. And that's goes back to Bentham and Mill and others of those philosophers. So I conceive the word well-being and welfare and utility as meaning very similar things in general, at least for policy purposes. So let me now talk about two well-being policy approaches. The first, which is very well known these days, is attributed to Amartya Sen. Martha Nussbaum has also contributed, and many others have. And Sen, in one of his great books, Development is Freedom, but also elsewhere, has said that policy should expand the capabilities of persons to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. In other words, a public policy perspective should improve people's capabilities, which he refers to as their opportunities or their freedoms to do things. And that will help them improve what he calls their functionings. In other words, what they actually achieve in terms of their material and non-material welfare. Sen's approach really builds on two previous approaches. One was was James Tobin, Nobel Prize-winning economist, who talked about specific egalitarianism. Tobin was there saying, well, we may not be egalitarian in thinking everyone should have the same income or the same level of wealth or housing or whatever, but there are certain things where we should require an egalitarian distribution, and something like healthcare or provision for old age pensions, etc. So Tobin saw these, you can see these as capabilities of people, that these should be available to everyone. So he described that as specific egalitarianism. And that was a precursor to John Rawls, famous philosopher, who came up with the notion of primary goods, a very similar notion to Tobin's notion and similar to Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. And the important thing about these is that they emphasize the capabilities of everybody in society. There are some difficulties with this approach when it comes to public policy, or some challenges, I should say. And one of them is who decides which capabilities are important for policy. Martha Nussbaum was more, I'd say, paternalistic than Sen. She specified 10 particular capabilities that must be reached, whereas Sen says he refuses to specify which capabilities we should have, just says that people should have reason to value those capabilities. But then again, that requires an outsider to say, do you have reason to value your position? Having said that, though, with this challenge, the capabilities approach has been popular in some policy contexts. It's used, for instance, in what's called the multi-dimensional poverty approach that Sabine Alkir and others have championed. This is similar to the idea of primary goods or specific egalitarianism. It says we should have a number of areas which are particularly important for people in terms of their capabilities. We set thresholds for each of those indicators, whether it be a particular level of housing or a particular form of transport that people should have. They then count the number of thresholds that a person falls below. They may fall below, say, on 20% of thresholds, but fall above on 80%. And then the person is deemed to be in multi-dimensional poverty if they fall below, say, a third of the indicators. And these indicators in developing countries are typically things like does your house have an earthen floor, or does it have a floor that's made of something more substantial than earth? Do you have access to at least a bicycle when it comes to getting your produce to town, etc.? And then from a policy perspective, policies aim to reduce the number, to target particular aspects where people are falling below those thresholds in order to reduce the number of people who are in multidimensional poverty. Again, this comes with the problem that certain outsiders have to choose which indicators and which thresholds are important. So there's a certain level of paternalism here, whereas an individual person may not want a bicycle or may be quite happy with an earthen floor or whatever the other indicator is. But this is very closely modelled on the approach of Sen and Rawls and Tobin. And it's been adopted, not the multidimensional poverty approach, but the capabilities approach has been adopted strongly by the OECD in their How's Life framework, also referred to as the Better Life Index, which is built on the How's Life framework. They say there are 11 key dimensions to current well-being, so income and wealth and work and housing and health and education, etc. But we should look not just at averages of those particular dimensions. We can think of those as capabilities to some extent. We should also look at inequalities. So this is where the fairness angle comes in. And they identify 3 different types of inequalities. One is inequalities between groups. Do we have different outcomes, for instance, between men and women, or between indigenous people and colonizing people, etc.? A second type of inequality is between top and bottom performers, most obviously in terms of things like income and wealth, but also in terms of health and education, etc. Or we could focus just on the deprivation side, those who are actually like the multidimensional poverty indicators, just those who are who are deprived in some sense within those dimensions. So this is very much like the threshold idea of the multidimensional poverty approach. So this is really built on the capabilities approach, and nicely in the OECD framework, they also talk about we also have to make sure that we have sufficient resources for future well-being. So in terms of fairness, we should be thinking not just of the current generation, but also are we leaving sufficient stocks of natural capital, human capital, economic capital, and social capital for future generations? So are we being fair to future generations? So there's a strong sustainability angle to the fairness framework here. You'll also see this approach, especially it's really like the multi-dimensional poverty approach, being reflected in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, 17 different areas there where there are indicators for each one of them. And of course, the OECD has indicators for each of their areas as well. The question I ask as a person who's designing policy and who's been in a policy role for much of my life before I came to academia is how does one use dashboards like this to design policy? It's all very well to have lots of indicators, but how do we know which ones are the most important to address? For instance, if we have either the OECD or the UN's SDG approach, if we saw people falling below a threshold in education and also falling below a threshold on, let's say, health, should we target our resources mostly to education or mostly to health? Which one would be more important? And these approaches don't actually help us to prioritize policy in that way. So there's a gap in these approaches that as yet has gone unmet. The second main approach in the wellbeing policy space has been to rely on indicators of subjective well-being. Here I have Professor Richard Layard and Carol Graham, 2 main contributors to this, economists who are contributing to this area. Many others have, and many different disciplines, psychology, sociology, philosophy, geography. And the idea here is really to reflect more the utilitarian philosopher's idea of designing policies to maximize society's subjective well-being, or the subjective well-being of people in society, where we may give greater weight to people at the lower end of the scale. So we may be trying to maximize or increase the subjective well-being of people who are currently having low well-being. Typically in the literature, we have three classes of measures, different sort of groups of measures of subjective well-being, SWB. One is evaluative well-being, which tends to be based on a measure of life satisfaction. I'll show you some questions shortly, and this really accords more with the economist's idea of welfare or utility. There are measures of affect or happiness, anxiety, joy, these sorts of things. These are like shorter term indicators, and these are particularly used in the psychology literature. And then there's purpose in life, the sort of eudaimonia measures like the Bobby Kennedy discussion I had before. The nice aspect of the subjective well-being approach is that each measure is rated by the individual. It doesn't require a paternalistic outsider to specify what's important for well-being. Each individual person specifies what's important for their well-being. And these are now being used by economists in the United Kingdom and in New Zealand and elsewhere in what's called cost well-being analysis, where we try and design policies not just to look at monetary measures of outcomes, but in terms of well-being measures, and the notion of well-bees or well-being years are being used. So to give you an example of how we might use a measure of subjective well-being for policy, we might be wondering about the impact of a particular policy on subjective well-being. And an example that Richard Layard here uses is that a course for people who are depressed, a course in cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to lift their well-being. Just for my hypothetical example, I'll say it lifts their well-being by 1 point on a scale of 0 to 10. So they might have started off as a 4 out of 10. Now they rate their lives as a 5 out of 10. We can then estimate using statistical methods generally how many more dollars or yen would somebody require to lift their subjective well-being by 1 point. And we know that richer people tend to be happier, they tend to have greater life satisfaction. So we can estimate that it might cost, say, $20,000 for on average per year to lift somebody's well-being by 1 point. In that case, we could say the monetary equivalent of a course in cognitive behavioral therapy is $20,000. So we can use that estimate then in cost well-being analysis to say the benefits that accrue from a course in cognitive behavioral therapy is worth $20,000 in benefit terms. So, and then we can compare that with other measures and look at how much they increase subjective well-being by, and see which is the best, provides the best value for money in policy senses. So this is being used now. The UK Treasury's Green Book, which is their cost-benefit analysis manual, has this approach embedded in it. And the New Zealand cost-benefit analysis manual, the New Zealand Treasury, also has these measures built into it. And just in case you're wondering how we measure evaluative subjective well-being, these are the two most common questions. The first one's a little longer than the other. It's due to a person called Cantrell from the 1960s. Just says, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? So people write down 0 up to 10, whichever number they feel they are in terms of how they rate their life as a whole. And a simpler measure is just, this is the one from the World Value Survey. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? And many general social surveys of statistical agencies around the world now use questions like these in their general social surveys. The Gallup poll uses the Cantrell ladder question in its survey of 160 countries or so around the world. So these are used and have been shown to have a lot of very good statistical properties in terms of people's decision-making, etc. I can go into these analyses. These people, in case you're wondering, are Steven Pinker, Peter Singer, both, I guess, philosophers and linguists and all sorts of things, and Richard Eastland, famous economist, all of whom advocate using these sorts of measures. In case you're wondering how these measures look when people answer them, one of the criticisms when they've been used in Western countries is that people in Western countries tend to gravitate towards a 7 or an 8 or maybe a 9 when they're rating their lives on a 0 to 10 scale. But when this question is asked around the world and it's population weighted as it is here, this is from the World Happiness Report, which you can just download. This is the distribution of life satisfaction based on that question, called happiness here, but it's actually life satisfaction, around the world. And you'll see that, around the world, most people rate their lives as a 5 out of 10, and then there's reasonably similar to a normal distribution around that, slightly more at the upper end, and there's a slight bulge at 10, which you wouldn't expect in a normal distribution. That's mainly people either in richer countries or rich people in poorer countries. But overall, you see that many people, rate their lives very, very low in these distributions. And here, just out of interest, I've listed the based on the same measure on the average for 2016 to 18, the top 8 countries in terms of how people rate their lives, and the bottom 8 countries in terms of how people rate their lives. Don't worry about the color scheme, just look at the length of the overall bar. And you'll see that people tend to rate their lives most highly in terms of their satisfaction with their life, most highly in Northern European countries, plus New Zealand, and also Canada and Australia are very close to New Zealand. At the bottom end of the scale are countries that you would not be surprised to see where people rate their lives very poorly, mostly war-torn or extremely poor countries. So these measures seem to have a strong degree of validity. I mentioned that there are different measures of subjective well-being. There's the evaluative measure, which is life satisfaction here. This is an OECD summary of how we might think about these different things. OECD says we have life satisfaction, we have affect measures like happiness or anger, and we have the eudaimonia measures such as purpose and life. And then these 3 different sort of forms of subjective well-being may be determined essentially by the capabilities that people have, whether it's related to their income or their health or their ability to make social contact, etc., their culture, etc. So we can loosely think, and this is the way I tend to think of things, is that one's own subjective well-being is based on the capabilities that one has, which reflects the opportunities and freedoms that we have. So if we're thinking about from a policy viewpoint, if we're trying to improve subjective well-being, say life satisfaction, we probably have to work on these determinants of well-being, and especially the determinants that affect people whose well-being is at the lowest ebb rather than for those who are at the highest ebb. Traditionally, I won't go through this diagram, but I'm just saying what I want to show is that this is not a particularly new concept in economics, except for the use of the word well-being. For a long, long time, we've used what's called a social welfare function to think about trade-offs between the utility of different people, whether we just add together everyone's utility in the way that maybe John Stuart Mill would have done, or we could think about purely increasing the utility of the person at the very bottom of the scale, as Rawls would have done, or somewhere in between. So in practice, this is not a particularly new concept, but it's now, I guess, reappearing as importance. I will mention when we look at inequalities, though, and fairness, we should look both at measures, traditional measures of inequality and skewness. And the reason inequality, such as standard deviation, but in fact the 2 distributions may be oppositely skewed. And this is an example in a recent paper in Journal of Happiness Studies, where we show from the World Values Survey the distribution of life satisfaction in the Philippines and the Ukraine, and they're almost mirror images of each other. They have almost identical standard deviations, but very, very differently skewed, one to the right and one to the left. And clearly, they have different implications for fairness. So just as a practical measure, when we're thinking about measures, we shouldn't just be relying on measures of whether it's standard deviation or something similar. We should be thinking also how is the distribution skewed. Let me talk very briefly about some country experiences of using well-being for policy. And this, I have to say, what I'm going to say now is a cautionary tale, where most of these experiences have not been very, very useful to this date, although some have been better than others. So I'll start off with the first country in this list, Bhutan. Bhutan is very well known for its approach from 1972 onwards in terms of saying, let's not prioritize GDP, gross domestic product, let's prioritize gross national happiness instead, GNH. Interestingly, Michael Cameron, later the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, said something very similar before he was elected as Conservative Prime Minister of the UK. Bhutan's approach, though, is not really maximizing national happiness. It's a multi-dimensional poverty approach. It sets thresholds for a whole host of indicators and looks at how many people and which people are below the thresholds in an attempt to improve or reduce the degree of multi-dimensional poverty. So it's not really built on a happiness idea, it's built on a multi-dimensional poverty idea. Unfortunately, however, in practice, there haven't been large improvements in Bhutan over this time, this period of 50 years now. So the approach does not seem to have had very tangible benefits for people in Bhutan. So I think one has to question how well that's been implemented. In Australia, the Australian Treasury came up with an approach, a wellbeing framework in 2004, which was built on both the capabilities and the utilitarianism approach. But interestingly, they found it difficult to use for policy purposes, and it was actually scrapped in about 2017 and no longer used. So they came up with a beautiful framework, but it wasn't very useful for policy. Similarly, in France, a new law was passed in 2015 saying that government had to set out new wealth indicators, which are essentially well-being indicators, but they really have not paid attention to that since it was legislated, even though it's a part of the legislation and formally they have to follow it, but they don't. So that hasn't been very useful. In Wales, they passed at the same time the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. This is probably the best model that I think has been used around the world. It's one where each government agency has to state what their wellbeing goals are, and then at the end of the year state how they've gained, whether they've met those wellbeing goals. The Auditor General, an independent assessor, looks at whether those goals have been met, and is also a person who acts on behalf of future generations to see whether future generations are being looked after. So this is a very good model, in my view, the Welsh model. The United Arab Emirates have a beautifully detailed cost wellbeing analysis model, but it's set in a country with abysmal human rights, and so one has to wonder how much they actually adhere to what they say. And in New Zealand, we've adopted something very similar to the OECD Better Life Index, How's Life approach with what's called the Living Standards Framework, but it hasn't been much used to prioritise policy. In fact, the cost-benefit analysis approach has been more useful. So let me just give you some examples before I finish of how wellbeing may be used as a guide for policy. I'll quote some work from this World Happiness Report in 2013 relating to health. And one of the things we know is that bad health contributes negatively to well-being. But should we prioritize mental health or physical health when it comes to well-being? So if government is trying to improve subjective well-being of people, overall evaluative well-being of people, it can look at measures of how people rate their physical health and their mental health and see which one's most closely related to their subjective well-being. And in work that's carried out in that World Happiness Report, one can just, because these are standardized statistics, one can compare the relative sizes of the contributors to life satisfaction of mental health problems or physical health problems. In this case, it's whether people fall in the lowest quartile of life satisfaction. And what it shows is that for each of Britain, Germany, and Australia, the impact of mental health problems is much, much greater on life satisfaction than is physical health problems. But we know that governments throughout the world spend vast amounts more on physical health than they do on mental health. And this is suggesting, as does much of the wellbeing literature, that governments should be reorienting their health expenditures towards more expenditure on mental health issues rather than physical health issues. So this is a way we can actually quantify which one's more important. And at the moment, we can say it would be more important to increase resources to mental health issues rather than to physical health issues, using life satisfaction as the arbiter, if you like, of the policy. On the work side, we know that work is important for people's overall life satisfaction. It also turns out that it's very important for people's emotions. So if we look at measures of negative affect, in other words, unhappiness and anxiety and this sort of thing, we see that people's work status is very highly related, and especially people who are unemployed. So these are people who are unemployed who would like a job, have the effect of being unemployed has a very strong effect on negative affect. In other words, very strong impact on negative affect. People who are unemployed has a very strong negative happiness effect, if you like. So we can say, well, this is really stresses the importance of getting unemployed people back into the workforce. In New Zealand, we've, like the rest of the world, we've had COVID and lockdowns. And so we looked, and luckily in New Zealand, our statistics agency started quarterly surveys of wellbeing as part of our quarterly household labour force survey once COVID set in. And we can relate these to the previous measures, identical measures that were used in the general social survey for the adult population. And what we, interestingly in this graph, this is just averages, before lockdown, so in 2018, this is our most recent general social survey, on average, life satisfaction in New Zealand was rated at 7.7. During the first lockdown, which was a nationwide lockdown with COVID, but towards the end of that lockdown, as COVID was starting to ease, life satisfaction had increased to 7.9. So even though we were still in a lockdown phase, people's life satisfaction went up. Partly this was because at that stage, COVID was being overcome. We were getting to an eradication of COVID for a short time. And so people were feeling pretty happy, and we can see that people were generally happier. In the following quarter, in September quarter, there was an Auckland-specific lockdown, Auckland being the largest city in New Zealand, about a third of the country's population. And overall, life satisfaction in New Zealand went down with this second lockdown. And then once that was relieved, once we got rid of COVID a second time, people were very happy, and the life satisfaction went up to 8. But we can use the Auckland lockdown example as one where we can say, what's the particular effect of lockdown in a particular region when the rest of the country is not locked down? And in a recent paper that we published, we showed we could estimate the effect of the lockdown in Auckland specifically relative to the rest of the country. And we could show that the lockdown reduced life satisfaction in Auckland with their lockdown, and the effect was approximately 2/3 of the effect of being unemployed. Now, we know that being unemployed is one of the worst things that can happen to you in terms of your life satisfaction. So an effect size that's roughly 2/3 of being unemployed was strongly material. One of the interesting things, though, we found in terms of fairness is that we looked at it for different groups of the population. And what we found is that actually for people who are unemployed in Auckland, their life satisfaction went up during that second lockdown. Now, why might that be? Well, we know from the international literature that if you're unemployed in an area with high unemployment, that's not so bad, because lots of people around you are in the same position. If you're unemployed in an area where there's very low unemployment, then you stand out. You've got a stigma attached to you. So from a fairness point of view, it's very, very bad for your well-being if you're unemployed in an area with very low unemployment. We see this in the United Kingdom. So during a lockdown, if you're unemployed and no one else is going out to work, your life satisfaction actually increased, which was quite an interesting thing. What we did find, however, is that loneliness increased with lockdowns, and from a fairness perspective, what we found was that loneliness increased particularly severely for sole parents. So if we were thinking about repeating lockdowns for another pandemic, we would think that the main fairness issue that we might have to address is how do we deal with the situation of sole parents? They were particularly hard hit, being at home with children, not being able to see anyone. So we'd have to think particularly about how we can relieve the effects on them. This is an example of using a subjective well-being approach to see who is particularly affected by certain policies. Now, just generally speaking, just before I close, I'll say, well, much of the Western literature, summarised in this nice readable book by Richard Layard, says that, well, if you're looking at personal well-being, it's going to depend on your financial situation, your family and relationships, your work situation, community and friends, your health, your personal freedom, and your personal values, which may include your religious values. That's often seen to be a Western sort of approach. So in a recent World Happiness Report, the latest one, 2022, some academics from either from within Asia or who are now working in the States or elsewhere, said, well, let's look at values that are traditionally held more in East Asian countries, and also I might mention in indigenous cultures in the Pacific, and such as in my country, Maori and Pacific people. And there the concepts of balance and harmony, etc., are much more important. And so they incorporated those in surveys along with other measures of well-being to see how different cultures both valued balance and harmony and how they experienced balance and harmony. Clearly these values are prioritized in East Asian countries and other countries. But interestingly, they are experienced more by people in rich Western countries, is what they found. So people in rich Western countries perhaps have the money to be able to have a balanced and harmonious life because they are actually rich enough to be able to do so. Interestingly, it was seen to be cross-cultural that people in virtually all countries prefer to have a calm life to an exciting life. Again, we might think of this as something that's traditional in indigenous cultures, perhaps East Asian cultures, but in fact, this was in virtually every country except one. I think a majority of people prefer a calm life to an exciting life. But those people who most want to experience a calm life tend to be from poorer places, probably from places who are not experiencing a calm life now. So they're desiring to have a calmer life than they have now. But I think this raises a very interesting research agenda, which is when we think about fairness, we often have thought traditionally about fairness of income and wealth, more recently fairness about well-being in terms of evaluative well-being. But this might raise an interesting agenda about the fairness of the current distribution of calmness or balance or harmony, both within countries and between countries. Who is it within your country that is experiencing a calm life or feels that their life is balanced and harmonious? If this is valued by people in almost all countries, we should be thinking about which people are experiencing these emotions. So I'll leave it there. I'll just point you to the World Wellbeing Panel, which is a panel which does a survey every couple of months on issues of well-being. They're reported. You can just Google World Wellbeing Panel. But I think the summary aim of the World Wellbeing Panel is a very nice one. It says the panel is about the promotion of well-being as the ultimate purpose of all major decision makers, particularly government. And I'll leave it at that, Professor Ishido. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Arthur Grime, for your really comprehensive, historically based, discussion about, this, fairness, well-being, and, for in the context, public policy making. I was, searching around, before I invited you, and to try to find a connection between this, subjective type of well-being and then really objective type of, public policy making. And then I found that you are the right person because I noticed that you are also very much famous in the field of inflation targeting. so I know that this person, Professor Arthur Grimes, is the right person because he deals with, something, rather subjective, meaning I mean, well-being inside your human body and human mind, and also objective thing, utilizing the government funding, public policy making, using, limited amount of, tax money, etc. So utilitarian, of course, concept comes into the picture, internal happiness and then external like utility matching together for policy making. So I'm really interested in this kind of topic. But anyway, rather than making my own comment and questions, I would like to then invite the commentator. Actually, Professor, sorry. Okay, first, can I then invite, Professor Aaron Jarden? Are you, Dr. Aaron Jarden, are you here already? Yeah. Hello?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
Yep,
okay,
hello.
thank you very much. So, Dr. Aaron Jarden, thank you so much for your time with us. So he is going to make some comments about what was talked about by Professor Arthur Grimes. Dr. Aaron Jarden is a world-class expert on the issue of positive psychology and well-being. And then a very good research colleague of Professor Masaya Kobayashi at our university. But please bear with us. Professor Kobayashi just, texted me, and then he said, "Oh, because of my sickness, worsening sickness, let me log off." Oh, in spite of this very exciting, talk being held by Dr. Professor Arthur Grimes. So please bear with us. But he would have liked to continue, but because of his sickness, sorry about it. Okay, so anyway, Dr. Aaron Jarden is a very good, I would say, friend of Professor Masaya Kobayashi. So we would like to invite Dr. Jarden for your comment. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and I really appreciate and honour the invitation here today to this forum to discuss what I think is really interesting, but also really important topic and questions. So firstly, I'm very thankful for the invitation, and secondly, I'm hugely thankful and impressed to be able to comment on Professor Arthur Grimes' work, who I'm a big fan of, always have been, and I think is hugely impressive the way that he's steering that ship for New Zealand and for many other countries as well. So it's really a privilege and a delight to do so. So as Arthur was talking, I made some comments along the way. They're not in any particular order, but I'm just going to go over some issues which I think are related and I think important for moving this discourse around the relationship between well-being and fairness forward in any society. So I'm going to start with the way Arthur started, and that was really what do we mean by well-being? So here I think is potentially the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge across both academia and for policymakers and for real people in the way they live their lives. And by that I mean, I really don't think we know what we mean by well-being. My experience of looking at the interdisciplinary literatures, so what policymakers publish, what positive psychologists publish in their field, what philosophers, what economists publish, is very rarely do they define well-being. And when they do, it's a very vague kind of definition of well-being at best. So my field of positive psychology, probably as an example, the most commonly cited definition of well-being will be well-being is how people feel and how they function, both at an individual and social level, and how they evaluate their lives as a whole. That's probably the most commonly cited definition, but when you hear it, it kind of sounds like, yeah, that kind of sums up well-being. It sounds like a pretty good shot at it. But when you unpack it, there's a lot in that, how people feel. So we've got an emotions category, how they function. So we've got a behavioral category, at an individual and social level. So now we're talking about relationships between people and how they evaluate their lives as a whole. So now we've got a cognitive category. So we've got all these different constructs and categories within this definition. Each one of them can be unpacked and involved, just the emotions category. All different types of emotions are important for well-being. People have different views on which ones are more or less important, and then not just the types of emotions, but their actualization. So it can really quickly become very complicated when we unpack how people define and what they mean by well-being. So in my work, whether that be delivering or developing a well-being program, I always start with, well, what does well-being mean to you? And we have a conversation about that. So I'm a big fan of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he took the view that words get their meaning by how people use them in the language. So we don't so much start with a definition in a dictionary, but we ask people to unpack how they're using the term and what they understand by the term. So in some of my research, we've asked very different types of people. So nurses, teachers, lawyers, adolescents, Chinese individuals, students, all different types and ages of people, how they conceptualize well-being and what that term means to them. And what we find is drastically different answers. Their models and how they understand well-being is totally different. So for example, for an adolescent, a component of safety is really important. For a Chinese student, balance and harmony is very important. For lawyers and teachers and for nurses, it's really relational. They all have a different model of what's important for their well-being. Now, when we take that one level deeper and we ask about different types of well-being, so for example, nurses, when we ask nurses, what does well-being mean to you? They'll say it's about having good mental health, it's about having some enjoyment in life, they'll say it's about work-life balance, they'll say these kinds of things. But when we ask them, what does work well-being mean to you? So not in your life, but when you're at work, valued, it's about feeling respected, it's about having good relationships. So well-being means different things to different people, but it also means different things in different contexts and different places for people as well. So the more we unpack what well-being means to people, I think we're finding very different recipes for what that is. Now that's a problem if we want to get a definition which is so straightforward that it encapsulates everyone. I think the answer we're moving to is it's actually different for everyone, and where we need to start is unpacking what that is. Now that's important if we want to get fairness, because if you're in a position where well-being means something to you which is different to somebody else, and we're trying to get a policy to promote something to both people, if they want different things, it's going to be really hard to write that kind of policy. It's a bit like where Arthur was talking off about different cultural differences around well-being. So the work of Mosen Joshanalu and his fear of happiness scales, that in fact there are cultures around the world that individuals fear being happy because they don't want to be perceived to have happiness because their well-being is really socially constructed. So we have issues kind of like that come into this. So I'm just sort of coming back to how do we define well-being, I think, is a big problem, because everything starts from that. So our literature base, how we develop interventions, how we write policy. So I'm sort of saying one of the biggest problems here is really our understanding of what exactly well-being is. Now, the other part of that is it's very similar to many constructs in the way that we use language. So Arthur mentioned welfare, but we could say quality of life, we could say wellness, we could list life satisfaction, we can list a whole bunch of things that are used interchangeably in some of these literature bases, especially by the media, to mean well-being. Probably the biggest problem, even bigger than that, is when people talk about well-being, mostly what they really mean is ill-being. So they put well-being and mental health in the same category. Sometimes they refer to the WHO definition, but people talk about well-being all the time. But when you really get down to it, what they really mean is ill-being. They're talking about stress, anxiety, depression, things going wrong with people. And you're using this term well-being to encapsulate ill-being. So they're kind of using the term in a way which isn't consistent with the way the average lay people use the term. So that's another problem which is kind of intertwined with this. Now, so that's the first thing I'd say is I think one of the best advances we can make for policy is getting clearer about defining well-being, what well-being means to people, and what could then go into those models of well-being that are important to people. The second thing I'd probably say is when I think about well-being and fairness and policy, I really think about you can't really get well-being without first thinking about how people should live their lives. So that question is really, it's a political one, obviously, but it's obviously has a strong, lengthy roots in ethics. So the question, how should we live, is necessarily an ethical question, but it's also necessarily a political question, and that overlap is there through the academic literature and there through history as well. So I think when we think, how should we live our lives, you usually get the story from most people of, we want a life full of well-being. We want some happiness, some things that come through the tradition of the academics, but we don't really hear people saying so much about fairness than we do about well-being. So for example, if I ask the average parent, what do you most want for your kids? They'll tell you they want, usually health and well-being. They won't sort of say, I want them to live in a fair society. So that aspect of fairness isn't as forefront of people's minds as well-being. And that sort of gets to the issues that Arthur was raising, which is, what are the preconditions necessary for well-being? What are the determinants that would be needed for somebody to have a life full of well-being? And you might say the same for fairness, but if we're just sticking with well-being for a minute, there are things like, they need health, they need some resources, they need that aspect of freedom from war and some autonomy, freedom to as well. So there's a thinking around what are the preconditions for well-being. Now, this is also a bit of a problem in the academic literature base, because most of the research doesn't really differentiate between well-being as an input or as an output or as an outcome. So very often when you read articles in most disciplines, they're not very clear about whether they're talking about well-being as an input or as an output. Arthur was really clear in the sense of looking at well-being as an outcome and how to measure it in regards to its relation to policy. But I think that's another thing we need to think more about, is whether well-being is driving certain kinds of outputs, or whether it's the output we're interested in itself per se. The other part that I sort of, my mind was wandering a little bit when you were talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I've always, when that came out, my first initial impression of it way back when was, maybe they're putting the horse before the cart here, because what I think we want as societies and as a world is really sustainable well-being goals, of which development is a part, or maybe sustainable flourishing goals. So I was beginning to think about that and thinking about what happens when we don't have well-being in a society, or what happens when we don't have fairness. So we look at some of the work of the late Ed Diener, for example, and some of the studies he did, which really predicted that countries where the well-being really dropped, like the Arab Spring in Egypt's a really good example, when their well-being really tanked, that then led to massive upheaval and political controversy and changes of government and things like that. So, but we can say the same with fairness. People that live in societies that become unfair move away from those societies, or there's political upheaval as well. So there's this kind of relationship there. The other part that I think is really interesting in relation to the discussion around COVID and what you were saying there was, what COVID has really done is started a conversation about the importance of well-being. In many ways, people have gone through the COVID experience and thought more about what they really want out of life, which is something people really don't take the time to do very often. It takes an event like COVID or a traumatic injury or something like that for people to do that. So I think coming out of COVID, organizations, individuals are really starting to think about meaning and purpose and their well-being and the life they want to live, which they didn't necessarily, or at least to the same extent, happen before COVID. What hasn't happened, though, is a similar conversation around fairness, which I think would be great if we could throw that into the mix as well, because many of the issues to do with COVID, like the ones Arthur identified, weren't really realised. We don't have those conversations or discourse in the media or in the right circles about the people that were unfairly impacted by COVID compared to others. So you'd say, for example, people with a low level of resources who weren't able to use resources to navigate through COVID better than people with a high level of financial resources that were able to use those to navigate through COVID better, for just as one example. So I think the COVID experience, you could clearly say on just about any measure, had an unfair impact across various people in society, but we don't hear that, or we don't see that conversation, and we don't see the policy to remediate that now, which I think is really unfortunate, because that will have a generational impact. And part of that's because the discourse has really taken over from what are seen as bigger issues, the war in Ukraine, the global financial crisis, these sorts of things. So I'm not really an expert at that kind of level to make those kinds of judgments, but I just sort of noting that I think that conversation would have been a good one to have. The other thing about the COVID experience I think is really interesting is the people that have gone through that and come out better or have grown through the experience and benefited from things like lockdowns are the ones that have tapped into essentially psychological skills, which are not necessarily expensive. They're teachable skills. They're things like tapping into social networks, thinking more about a meaning and purpose in life, developing a sense of self-efficacy that they can manage through struggle when times are tough and things like this. So I think that was the lost opportunity through COVID, is that we didn't, well, no society really pivoted to think about how they could grow through that. But I also think that would have been a good combination with fairness to think about what would a fair and just society look like as people springboarded from COVID, rather than the sole discourse around economics and growth and whatnot, which again is necessary. I just thought it was overly dominant. Other comments I wanted to make were, I really liked your point about future generations and fairness to who. I think that's another, again, an ethical question. And with the younger generations, we're really seeing a big move towards sustainability of the planet and towards consideration of future generations. But it's a bigger conversation about, Peter Singer would say sentience, and including animals and other people as well. But this idea of fairness to who, I think was really nice as well. What else did I note down? I think that's what I've got at the moment. Are there any bits that you want me to talk a little bit more about, or maybe now might be a good time to bring Arthur in and just say, what do you think about some of that, Arthur?
Okay, so can you please, Professor Arthur Grimes, make your initial reaction, please?
Okay, I understand that Professor Mizushima is going to make some comments as well, so I'm happy to do some now or some later, whichever you prefer.
Yeah. So, okay, so if Dr. Jarden is fine with this, I mean, having Professor Mizushima's comment and discussion first, and then ask Professor Grimes to respond. Would that be all right? Okay.
Sure.
So thank you so much. Right. So thank you so much, Dr. Aaron Jarden, for your really insightful comments on what has been discussed by Professor Arthur Grimes. So at this point in time, I'd like to invite our project leader, Professor Jiro Mizushima, for his comment as well as his own additional discussion. So Professor Mizushima, please.
Hello, do you hear me? No, thank you for the insightful lecture from Professor Grimes and impressive comment from Professor Aaron Jarden. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to make some comment. One of the most interesting and even striking fact which was shown in the presentation of Professor Grimes was that under COVID-19, the life satisfaction of people in New Zealand increased rather than decreased, which was quite different from the general assumption in other countries. Yesterday, I read your recent article about well-being and pandemic in New Zealand. It was also quite interesting. And as is well known, New Zealand adopted a strict COVID-19 policy. And this policy was one of the most strictest COVID measures in the world. But at the same time, it is considered the New Zealand case one of the most successful case in the world. The COVID-19 mortality rate was low, and life expectancy actually increased during this period. New Zealand had fewer cases, fewer hospitalization, and fewer deaths. And so it is quite remarkable achievement, I think. However, in general, strict COVID measures, including lockdowns and restrictions on people's daily life, could cause discontent and discomfort and criticisms among citizens. It is widely thought. And it is, and in European countries, we saw many criticisms from people against government measures. And sometimes we saw a large scale of resistance from civil society, such as anti-lockdown movement. In this sense, the situation in New Zealand was quite unique. And as a political scientist, I think that the political leadership played an important role in New Zealand, especially the role played by the Prime Minister of New Zealand. The Prime Minister, she could, I think, deliver a clear message to the citizens during the pandemic about the critical situation in the country, and she could speak about what to do by for the people. I think it is quite successful political communication, and by this way, people could understand what must be done by the people to overcome the crisis. And as a result, COVID-19 did not have a huge negative impact of well-being in New Zealand, I suppose. And this development reminds me of the leadership of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She also could deliver a clear message to German citizens, and she kept support from German citizens. And it was somewhat different from neighboring countries in Europe. Anyway, in this way, even if people experience hardships, when they think the government, the politicians, they are doing the right thing, the government, if they think the government is treating citizens fairly, people would accept this hard situation. It might foster the national unity, and that sense of unity might increase life satisfaction. I would like to know, what do you think about this political communication and political environment and its relationship with fair treatment and fairness? Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Mizushima, for your comment. Professor Arthur Grimes, to respond to Dr. Aaron Jarden and Professor Jiro Mizushima's comments, please.
Yes, I think what the comment by Professor Mizushima is a fantastic example of a number of the issues that Aaron raised in his area. So let me deal with the specifics of COVID and relate those back to some of the comments that Aaron had made in his commentary. COVID-19 came to New Zealand at a time when we had a fairly new government and a very popular government, where a young, charismatic Prime Minister had been elected and had strong support to essentially change the way that politics was done in New Zealand. Essentially, I think was probably the message, if you like. She referred constantly to the team of 5 million. In case you're wondering why 5 million, that's how few people we have in New Zealand. It's a population of 5 million. So it was consistently that the team of 5 million can do this, the team of 5 million can do that. And what's more, it's not just, we're doing that to help the people who are most at risk of bad outcomes from COVID-19. So she immediately gave people a reason to, that by being locked down in our own homes, we were serving the country by not giving COVID to people who would die from it. So people felt they were rewarded in themselves, that idea of eudaimonia, the purpose in life. You had a purpose in lockdown. I think it was a very unusual situation that people felt good about being locked down in the first lockdown. So I'll say this, in the very first lockdown, almost everyone felt good about it. There was a few people who had to work very, very long hours, obviously medical people and all those sorts of people, people working supermarkets or whatever, but it's a very small proportion of the population. Everyone else was essentially on holiday for a month or 2 months. It was the most, New Zealand has a high level of social capital anyway, and we went into another feature of this is we went into COVID with a long history of having amongst the highest trust in government of any country in the world, and trust in other people. So trust in those sort of measures of social capital is very high in New Zealand. And she, the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, leveraged that high level of trust and willingness to help others. In fact, it was the situation where people were allowed, because we only have 5 million people in a country the size of Japan, same area. So you can imagine there was plenty of space for people to walk around outside. We could walk around the neighborhood as long as we didn't go within 2 meters of another person. Everyone in every community was walking around the streets. There was no cars. Walking around streets, meeting neighbors that they hadn't seen for years, or meeting new neighbors or people in their communities, because we were allowed to walk around. It was the most extraordinary community event that lasted for 1 or 2 months. And so people felt very, very good about that, and they were serving the country at the same time by being on holiday. It felt very good. That was why life satisfaction went up strongly in that first lockdown, and we succeeded in eliminating COVID at that stage. The communication was superb. Now, when it came to the second lockdown, which was more specifically targeted at Auckland, the beneficial effects had worn off. It was now becoming clearer that maybe COVID would keep reappearing. We eliminated it, but now we've got it again, and we're going to have to keep on going through this cycle. Also, people in Auckland felt, well, the rest of the country is not being locked down much. We had a tiny lockdown in Wellington, but not much. And so they felt, in relative terms, they felt worse off. They could see the rest of us still enjoying life, and they were not enjoying, they were now being locked down. And I think it came to this issue of that Aaron referred to, the difference between freedom from and freedom to. We were all benefiting in terms of freedom from COVID. New Zealand, as you said, had a very low rate of COVID, very low rate of deaths. The lockdowns were keeping us free from COVID, but it was not giving us the freedom to go about our lives. And the first lockdown, no one worried about that, because we all felt wonderful, that we were serving the country and serving these people who were most at risk. Once it got to the second, and then there was a third and I think fourth lockdown after that, people started prioritizing freedom. Many people, not everyone, some people started prioritizing freedom too. And that's where the dissatisfaction came in. And partway through last year, there was a huge protest, occupation of Parliament grounds here, very similar to Canada, which is actually over the road from where my office building is for the university. So we actually couldn't come into our offices for a period of 4 to 6 weeks because of the number of protesters that would block the streets. We're camping there. It was a terrible situation. And these were the people that prioritized freedom too. They wanted to be able to go about their lives. By this stage, we'd also introduced vaccine mandates. People lost their jobs because they refused to be vaccinated. And so while the government was prioritizing freedom from COVID, they weren't prioritizing freedom to go about your life. And once the freedom from had worn off, the pleasure of that had worn off, many people started saying, no, we want our lives back. We want freedom to go about our life, even if there's a risk of dying. So I think this is it's a lovely example that you've raised. The communications were fantastic to start with. They weren't so good later on. The justifications for I supported the vaccination mandates. I supported everything the government did through this period, but I don't think the later communications kept people on side, kept this fringe, if you like, on board. And the protests became violent. You know, it was awful. They almost burnt down our law school where they were camping, and it was, you know, it was a very difficult situation. So I think this whole area of leadership, but it also has to be leadership with a view that there are different, as Aaron started off, what does well-being mean for you? And unfortunately, mainly for the civil servants who work in Wellington, freedom from was the most important thing for most people who work here and so supported government. But people in government and officials are often out of touch with people in other parts of the country. And what was important for people in terms of the well-being of people in many other parts of the country was freedom to go about their lives. So we had different conceptions of well-being. The officials here wanted to be paternalistic and look after people's lives for them, whereas many people didn't want paternalism. They wanted to go about their own individual lives. I live part-time in a community near Auckland, rural community near Auckland, where probably half the people were anti-vax, refused to be vaccinated. It's sort of a group of people who probably grew up in the hippie era, and so they believed in individual freedom. These people were kicked out of the volunteer fire brigade because to be in the volunteer fire brigade, you had to be vaccinated if you were going to go to somebody's house to fight the fire. So these people, they were kicked out of the surf lifesaving club because they couldn't go about saving people in the surf, you know, if they weren't vaccinated. So there were people suddenly lost large parts of their lives that they valued. So this is where the whole well-being crux of policy becomes very difficult when people value different aspects of well-being. And this is the point I think Aaron made so eloquently, that how do you design policy when people have different conceptions of well-being for themselves? So I thought your example, Professor, was just a superb example of the kind of issues that Aaron raised, because different parts of our lockdown process, we went through different challenges in terms of well-being. Aaron raised the point, I'll just comment on two other of his points. One is that when we refer to well-being, we're often referring to ill-being. I think one of the good things about the well-being approach is that it is trying to reorient towards well-being as opposed to ill-being. You know, traditionally we've talked about mental illness, but I think if we talk about mental health, that's actually, you know, we want to be improving people's mental health. We don't want to be just dealing with mental illness. We want to be improving mental health. We want to be improving people's physical health, their opportunities, etc. So we might want to be raising the well-being of people who are not just at the bottom end of the scale, but also higher up the scale, because there might be opportunities to raise the well-being of everybody. You know, many people I know, and you will know, who are well off, but their well-being's only, you know, it's not 9 or 10 out of 10 because their work-life balance is not good. They're working such long hours. So for these people, we wouldn't traditionally be thinking about policies to improve their well-being. But in fact, we should be thinking about policies to improve their well-being if their work hours are too long. You know, we should be thinking about how we can overcome these problems in many societies where people work too long hours. So I think the emphasis on well-being is important rather than just the emphasis on ill-being. And I'll just mention, actually, Aaron, you've given me I teach a course on public policy and the economics of well-being. And I often think about how should I start that course? It's a graduate course. I'm going to be when I next teach it, it'll be starting with the question, what does well-being mean for you? I think that's a wonderful opportunity to then get into, okay, and then actually I imagine the first assessment is going to be, and contrast that with the two main approaches to well-being in the literature as to how you think what well-being means for you relates to the literature. I think actually this helps us to think about these complexities of well-being approaches because of these individual ways of interpreting well-being. So thank you both for your comments. They've been extremely useful to me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Arthur Grimes, for your comprehensive type of responding. I have my own comment, but before I lose the opportunity to ask, Professor Masaya Kobayashi, he has returned back from his condition. So he texted me right now because he really want to contribute to this, session. So to the extent possible, Professor Kobayashi, can you please make your discussion comment, and then I wish to, summarize. Thank you so much.
Sorry, because of my poor condition, I have to leave some of your speeches. But I've seen your slides, so I'd like to make some questions to your arguments. Now, I very firmly believe that your approach, including SWB well-being, is very useful for policy analysis and policy makers. I believe such approach should proceed with a consideration regarding fairness. And in our forthcoming books on fairness, my chapter on Japan proved that health conditions and various Japanese well-being has been influenced by fairness. And our another article argues that demonstrates that Japanese people's or citizens' health has been greatly influenced by income equality and also fairness. So our demonstration has been very similar to your arguments and Western demonstrations. So my question, because I'm a political philosopher and public philosopher, and I'm very interested in the relation between your well-being approach and philosophy and ethics. You mentioned with regard to economics, some approach has been derived from utilitarian approach, and also capability approach derived from that and improves to another direction. But positive psychology approach has been argued that there are two kinds of well-being conception. One is hedonic conception of well-being. Another is ethical and eudaimonic conception of well-being. So my first question is, how do you think of eudaimonic conception of well-being? Because you emphasize the importance of SWB approach. My second question is that you seems to be interested in ethics as well as economy. So such kind of consideration have some relationship to the analysis or results, just as sense approach or capability approach do that. So my second question is that point. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I didn't quite get the final question, so if I don't answer that absolutely clearly, let me know. The eudaimonic side, I think what we see from the evidence is the eudaimonic factors are very important when it comes to people's overall, how they feel about their life. So even if I would, given my disciplinary background, saying people's sense of eudaimonia feeds into their overall evaluation of their life. Somebody who thinks they're doing something worthwhile is much more likely to be have a high evaluation of their life satisfaction. Where should we see this in data that relates people's occupations and income to their overall life satisfaction? So there's a clear relationship in every country that richer people on average tend to be happier. But when we look at that across occupations, we see that, say, the average life satisfaction of people who describe their role as a priest or a reverend or religious figure, they don't earn much money, but they're very happy. Their life satisfaction is very high because one expects they have a very high level of eudaimonia. Other people who have jobs that are not highly valued in society in a status sense or an ethical sense, tend to they might have very very high incomes, but their life satisfaction is nowhere near as high as you would expect them to be, given how much they're earning. So the way people view the status of and the purpose of their role in life tends to be influenced very strongly their overall life satisfaction. I have to say that economists and statisticians are bang on the line, the regression line, for the relationship between life satisfaction and income. So as you would expect, we sort of, we're there exactly. But other people, farmers, for instance, their life satisfaction is much higher than you would expect given their income, like priests. So I think eudaimonia is a very, very important part. However, I don't think it's something that government can do much about. I think this is something which comes back to personal ethics, personal family situation, your upbringing, and these sorts of things. Individuals can do something about it, but I don't think it's something that government can actually do much about, except in that very isolated instance of, say, the first lockdown in New Zealand, where we all felt like we had a purpose in life, which was to be on holiday. So I think it's very, very important, but probably not an area for public policy to concentrate on, particularly, unless it can really think of something. The second area is in terms of the ethics side. Different philosophers come to these things from different angles, and Aaron mentioned Peter Singer, great Australian philosopher, who is, these days pretty much a utilitarian, basically saying we should be thinking about people's overall evaluation of their life. Interestingly, he is very similar to Jeremy Bentham in the sense that he says, but we shouldn't just be thinking about people. This should be referring to all people, so that's nice. That's from a fairness angle, that's really important. But both Singer and Bentham said this should also extend to animals. And I think that's a really interesting sort of situation. Okay, we can be thinking about even from a utilitarian perspective, but this doesn't mean that it has to be purely human-centric. And I think that's quite a challenge as to how far you take this beyond humans, and then which animals and etc. We try and kill bacteria, so I guess that's not too friendly to those bacteria. So we have to make an ethical decision somewhere along the line. But I guess that's the sort of ethical position I have, is that these concepts should apply to all people, I think, and that's both Bentham and Singer would say that, and other philosophers would say that, Sen would say that as well. And to me, that's just a very nice starting point. If we're prepared to have this philosophy for some people, we should have it for everyone. What that then raises is an issue, though, that I think it was probably Peter Singer that raised it. Okay, so if we had this purely utilitarian approach, and we want to improve the welfare or the well-being of people in our country, why would we limit that just to people in our country? Why wouldn't we use, in a rich country like New Zealand or Japan, why wouldn't we vastly increase our overseas aid contributions to increase the well-being of people outside of our country? Ethically, how do we make a distinction between helping people within our borders and the well-being of people outside of our borders? Now, New Zealand has a very low level of foreign aid, of what we give. We accept very few refugees. And under this current government, despite being a well-being oriented government, we've had also a very anti-immigration policy, very strongly anti-immigration policy. Whereas previously, in non-well-being oriented governments, we've had a very open immigration policy. So there are some challenges here, I think, as to how we think ethically, who should be covered by these well-being policies. I can see from a political angle, obviously you want to concentrate on your own country, right? They're the people who vote for you. You're a political philosopher. So it's these are the things that governments have to do, but I do question whether we draw the line too narrowly. Personally, I think we should be doing more in a sense of trying to help other countries, but that's a personal view, and I wouldn't stand for office because I would never get elected.
Oh, may I ask additional questions? I totally agree with your orientation to include, for example, animals, and also I believe future generations. And I actually discussed with Peter Singer when he visited Chiba University. I respect him very well. But his approach, obviously, utilitarian, negative utilitarian approach. So obviously there are other currents of political philosophy, such as the ontologists, which emphasize rights. And so, as you know, that Amartya Sen tries to combine consequentialism with a rights approach. I suppose that you will do something like that. But so there are another currents of political philosophy, such which emphasizes the importance of good life or ethical points. And so my question or my impression from your answer is that you obviously recognize the importance of eudaimonic conception of well-being, but you say that government policy which relates to value judgments should be cautious. And I think that you obviously are positive for utilitarian or subjective well-being approach in considering public policy, but you are very careful other kinds of ethical considerations such as communitarianism or virtue ethics and so on. So my additional question is that my impression is right, or you can say something about these points.
Very good questions, and you're searching me well. I have a very strong belief in the importance of rights, and to me that they're the underpinning of capabilities, as Sen would argue as well, opportunities and freedoms, etc. And to me, they're also the underpinnings of subjective well-being. So, one could say I'm purely seeing that as a means to an end. Rights are hugely important as a means to an end. In fact, I've just written a paper currently being reviewed at a journal on who benefits most from freedom of speech, using data from around the world for a long time. Interestingly, one could have two hypotheses on this, right? One could think freedom of speech is most valued by rich people. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's the kind of thing that once you've got self-actualization, you can afford to think about freedom of speech. On the other hand, you could say freedom of speech is most important for the marginalized. And so that's the only way they can make their concerns heard. So we tested this in terms of its relationship with subjective well-being by looking at changes over time across countries, and found that it actually helped the marginalized most. So freedom of speech was most important for the marginalized. So from a purely sort of positivist angle, I could say freedom of speech is important because it helps the well-being of the people at the bottom end the most. I would probably go further than that, however, and my own personal ethics, and say freedom of speech is important no matter what. But then of course we still have those issues that we have to address. What about hate speech? What about what about misinformation? How far do we allow freedom of speech? And these are topics obviously of major importance at the moment. But so I'm not purely positivist. I do think there is an inherent right to freedoms in general, human rights in general. But I think they also have a very strong positivist sort of play in here. And then the good life, etc. What I think we should make sure that policy does not prevent people from leading a life that they value, a good life, a eudaimonic sort of life. I don't think it can do much to promote it, but I think it should make sure that it's not preventing it. It can certainly prevent it, as we see in many countries.
Well, thank you very much. And our data in Japan proves that freedom of speech or political participation increases people's well-being. In that sense, your argument is right, also in Japan. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's very good to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Grimes and Professor Kobayashi. So now we still have 20 minutes or so. So let's open the floor for Q&A, because we have participants, I guess, from, for example, Mexico, and also from, a Chinese scholar is also attending, I know. So if any one of you, and then I now see my younger colleague who's a philosopher. So anyone, please, just contribute. by asking questions, please. Yes.
Professor
Yes.
just before we get to
Yeah, sure.
questions, I wonder if I could just quickly comment on a point that Arthur made,
Sure.
because I think it's
Please, Dr. Jarden, please. Yes.
I won't take too long, but I think it's a really important one, and that is, like, so I'm a New Zealander who's based in Australia now, so I'm kind of looking from afar back at the comments Arthur made on how the COVID was experienced, and I see New Zealand, having come from New Zealand, as a really resilient country. It has those farming values of sort of get on with the job, sort of built in. So it has a strong degree of resilience, but it also has had a lot of leaders in the past which are very visionary and future focused, the likes of Sir Edmund Hillary and Sir Peter Blake and those four. So it's a country which really pulls people into a future compared to what I experience here in Australia. Now, your comment about what can policy makers do in regards to teaching around eudaimonic well-being, I think what we're experiencing here in Australia is what I'd love to see in New Zealand and elsewhere, and that's a great drive within the education system for a new field called positive education. So when I think about how can we get more well-being or how can we get more fairness, the biggest vectors which we can reach people through is through school and education or through work. Now, through school and education here, many of the private schools, many of the public schools, many of the Catholic schools have been intentionally teaching people the skills of well-being, particularly around eudaimonic well-being, how to think about meaning and purpose in life, how to figure out what their strengths are, how to utilize them more, these kinds of aspects and issues. And all that research is clearly demonstrating that the links, once they leave school, go from well-being to engagement, engagement to productivity, productivity to success. So well-being is a real driver of economic outcomes. The literature really clearly shows that as well. So what I'd love to see policymakers do is really start that conversation about what is our education system for. That, you know, we've passed the Industrial Revolution now. It's not really about just knowledge. It's really about skills. And what are those skills beyond academics that really should be built into our education system? And that's where I'd love to see policy around actually teaching the skills of well-being. But beyond that, it's not just about well-being. Philosophical skills around reasoning, so we can have discussions and debates about things like fairness, I think would be hugely important as well. So that's just my kind of 2 cents on. I think it can be done. I'd love to see it being done, and I think what they're leading here in Victoria and Australia is world leading and showing that it can be done as well.
So, Professor Arthur Grimes, any response, please? Please.
Sounds great to me. I'll try and send my grandchildren over there.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So we have Dr. Takayuki Kawase, right? Our promising scholar in the field of, I think, of philosophy. So please, okay.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Okay.
Yes, so, we hear you.
All right. Thank you. So I have a question to Professor Grimes about the meaning and this definition of well-being, probably related with the comment of Dr. Jarden. So I am Takayuki Kawase from Chiba University. So thank you very much for your lecture. It was very suggestive and exciting for me. And my question is about, yes, the idea of the well-being and its definition. And I am afraid that the idea of well-being is so broad and general that it looks sometimes logically trivial, which means anything good included into the category of well-being, and there is no logical space outside the idea of well-being. And if so, by referring to the idea of well-being, we can say anything and even totally opposite things at the same time. So anything goes, even anything contradictory. For example, the argument for the strict rule of quarantine of COVID and the loose rule of quarantine at the same time. So the completely opposite things are possible inside the same theory. So tell me, by using the idea of well-being, what idea can we exclude from our discussion? So I'm very sorry for a little bit provocative opinion. So I really appreciate your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for
Please,
that question. The way you put the last bit, I think, is superb. What should we exclude from the definition? I remember being at an economics conference once before when somebody had a theory and somebody asked, so that sounds so what predictions would it exclude? So I think it's a great way of thinking about it. From my perspective, and this reflects, I guess, my training as an economist, I like to leave the judgment of well-being up to an individual person rather than government. So that's why I'm not keen on these sort of big checklists of lots of different indicators of well-being, because one could say, yes, we're doing these policies and some well-being's gone, some indicators have gone up, some have gone down, all these sorts of things like in the Better Life Index or the New Zealand Treasury's approach. I tend to look at it as saying, well, the closest measure we've got that's useful for policy often are measures of self-rated subjective well-being, such as life satisfaction. And so if I ask somebody, how satisfied are you overall with your life? And I do that before a policy and after a policy, and I have a control group and a treatment group, and I see that the well-being of the treatment group has gone up as a result of the policy relative to the life satisfaction of the treatment group has gone up relative to those who weren't treated, and especially if the treatment was random, then I think to myself, okay, well, that's a measure of self-rated satisfaction with their life that's gone up as a result. And so ideally, we would want that to be a randomized control trial where some people got treatment, some people didn't, and we could see, whether things went up. Now, I'll give you an example of where that's being used in my own work. Recently, we were asked to evaluate what seems like quite a small program in a way. The government subsidises poorer households in New Zealand to put in a heat pump, a type of heater, okay, reverse air conditioning. It's the most efficient form of electric heating. And before we were asked to evaluate this, we looked at the life satisfaction of each person in the study. We then monitored their homes for temperatures and all sorts of things like that as well. Then they got their heat pump, which turned out to be randomly timed because of lockdowns, as it turned out, and supply chain problems. So when they got their heat pump, it turned out to be completely random. Then we had a second survey, some of whom had received their heat pumps, some of whom hadn't, some of whom had just got them, some of them had had them for 3 months or so. We had a second survey where we repeated the same questions as in the first survey, including questions on life satisfaction. And what we could tell there is that people who had received their heat pumps and had had them for longer, not just had received them, but had received them now for a few weeks as opposed to just having received them, their life satisfaction on average went up. Relative to the control group, if you like, of people who hadn't received them or had only just received them recently. So that seemed to be a reasonable indicator that this program not only had benefits on electricity use and temperatures and all those sort of things, but people actually felt better about their lives as well. And to me, that's one way we can use these sort of concepts in a public policy setting in a useful way to say, does this seem to have any effects beyond the tangible things we can measure? So that's sort of the type of thing that we can do now. And a similar sort of one is the example I used on cognitive behavioral therapy, where we could look at, if we randomized, say, between treatment of depression through drugs or through cognitive behavioral therapy, which of those has the bit more has the larger effect on somebody's overall satisfaction with their life. They're both treatments for depression, but we can see whether one group has increased their satisfaction with life more than the other group. So we can use that as a measure. Now, people might say, but that's not the right measure. But, I suppose you have to start somewhere, and that's, for public policy, it's an additional piece of information that we didn't have before. Does that help to answer? Or you might have this.
Yes,
That's not appropriate.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I understand that the well-being approach is very useful for a lot of kind of public policy. And on the other hand, I wondered if it is useful for any kind of public policy. So, and does it mean it is really useful or not? So actually, I think, yeah. So the well-being approach is, too much, useful in my opinion. So it can use for any kind of it's any kind of public policy, so anything. So and so yes, that is I think good thing. But yeah, thank you anyway.
Actually, if I could just put a little caveat to what I said. It's useful, I think, when we expect policies to have a large effect on somebody's overall satisfaction with their life. If we're using a life satisfaction measure, it's not so useful for smaller things. So we do have measures as well which come back to measures of affect, so sort of short-term joy, satisfaction, etc. And these are increasingly being run now with people with smartphones, and what you do is you send them a little message at a particular time, at random time during the day, saying, what are you doing at the moment? Who are you doing it with? And how do you rate your joy, your happiness sort of right now, not your overall satisfaction with your life. And that can be useful for looking at much more specific policies, which could be much more useful at the local level. For instance, we're doing something at the moment with public housing tenants using that technique. Or people are using it with, are you near green space at the moment, for instance. So you can sort of look at the effects of being in and around nature and green space by, if they happen to be near green space at the moment and they're feeling happy about it, then you can measure that. It may not have an effect on their overall life satisfaction. So we can I think, we're starting to get some better measures of some of these things and using them, and they're all experimental. I have to say that, but they're giving us more insight.
Thank you so much for this really insightful and stimulating, discussion. Right. So, okay, the floor is still open. About 10 minutes. Any comments or questions? It's a precious occasion, because very famous, renowned scholars. Two of them are here today. So, any intervention or a question from Mexico or from a Chinese perspective? I know you are present here, right? Okay. Yes, Mr. Alfonso Torrero. Doctor, are you already Dr. Alfonso Torrero, right? Anyway, okay, please. So unmute yourself, please, from Mexico. Please unmute yourself.
I'm not still a doctor. I need to do the dissertation exam, but almost, okay. I hope so. Yes. Well, thank you for the interesting presentation, Dr. Grimes. I have a comment followed by a question. So a week ago or so, I read an article about Mexican young adults' life satisfaction, or uncertainty was one constant word in their life perception and worries. For example, they expressed uncertainty about maintaining their jobs, having enough resources for a comfortable life. So probably many Mexican young adults have a low subjective well-being score, right? So in addition, social stigma and social pressure tend to silence young adults' perceptions and opinions. So having this in mind, could you describe one successful policy, or can you think about one successful policy that helps to raise subjective well-being of a population sector that feels undervalued or lives in uncertainty, for example? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think you're correct that issues of job uncertainty, etc., and other forms of uncertainty reduce overall life satisfaction. I think there's no doubt about that. You also mentioned social pressure, and one thing I did not mention really in my first talk, but is that we the way people value their overall life is very relativistic. So it's very much done in terms of how you see where you are relative to other people. I did mention the unemployment example. Much better to be unemployed in an area with high unemployment than in an area with low unemployment, because everyone around you is in the same boat. So it's so these things are important. I'm trying to think of a particular example which has been used to improve the life satisfaction of particular groups. I mean, I know there's I mentioned the area of green space, that people have done some experiments in terms of just trying to improve the natural environment for people, and there's some evidence that you know can improve people's lives. That people are much better when they're surrounded by green space than when they're in a heavily built up urban environment with no green space. As I say, the work I'm doing in New Zealand at the moment shows that just making houses not being so cold. New Zealand houses are very cold traditionally. For some reason, we think people moved to New Zealand from Europe thinking that we were a warm Pacific country, but we're not. We're a cold Pacific country, and they build houses as if we were a warm Pacific country, so our houses are very cold. The work that we're doing, the government is doing, and we're evaluating, to improve the group of the population that are poorer and live in cold houses, that really does, we show that this reduces their well-being. And if you improve their insulation and their heating opportunities and things like that, that actually improves their well-being, because they're no longer subject to so much cold. So, you know, we've got some quite good evidence that we can use public policies to improve the well-being of certain groups that we know are particularly at risk, in this case, poorer people who live in cold houses. I'm trying to think of an example, though, where something's been evaluated to reduce the uncertainty that people face. That would be a really interesting example. And I'm sure somebody has, but for the life of me, I can't think of a study which has said, here's been a policy intervention that is basically designed to reduce people's uncertainty. I mean, to some extent, our first lockdown did. You know, I mean, there was uncertainty about COVID, there was uncertainty about jobs, and we had a very strong, at the same time, the government put in a very large wage subsidy so that most people retained employment through a very, very severe lockdown. So that reduced people's uncertainty. But we can't quite attribute the rise in well-being to that reduction in uncertainty. It might have been other things. But I think that would be an excellent research project, actually, to see if there was a policy that actually reduced people's uncertainty, let's say leaving education and being guaranteed a job or something like that, you know, which reduces one of the big uncertainties in life for young people. That would be a fabulous thing to evaluate, but I can't think of an example, sorry. I should mention, of course, the people in Central America, Mexico through to northern half of South America, most of Latin America, in fact, tend to have high values for life satisfaction, much higher than you would expect than given their incomes. And Mexico is actually no exception. Costa Rica, though, is the outstanding example. And I think one of the things about Costa Rica is that it has democracy. It's got very strong, you know, human rights. It's got fantastic nature, and it has superb attachment of social capital, friends and family, and those sorts of things. You know, so it meets a lot of the tests of for high life satisfaction, even though it's a middle income country. So its life satisfaction tends to be higher than, say, United States or United Kingdom. So in other words, you can make up for a lack of income through some of these other features that are really important. And I really don't know what its situation is in terms of uncertainty or worry, but I imagine it's a lot less than in many other similar countries.
Can I just add to your comment, Arthur, there,
Sure,
and this
please.
is for you and Alfonso, and I'm a huge fan of Mexico because Mexico hosts probably what I think is the best example of a wellbeing university in the world. Tec Milenio and Tec de Monterrey, you know, the only university where every single student in every single discipline does a wellbeing course and learns the skills of wellbeing, and that's why it has the highest graduate employment rate of any university in the world, potentially. But back to your point about money and well-being, Arthur. So I totally agree. The evidence is that those with more resource have slightly higher well-being, but that difference isn't huge. One of the results we got out of the New Zealand Wellbeing study was those that were living within their means had much higher well-being than those that didn't. So people that earned $200,000 a year but spent it all, their well-being was quite low, or spent more, they felt stressed. But people earning just $50,000 but were living within their means had very high well-being. So we kind of figured out that the odds ratio, or that the power of that relationship, was much more important than the sheer amount of money you were earning. So when we look around countries in the world, some of the happiest people in the world live in the slums of Calcutta. They don't have a lot of resources, but they're living within their means, and they're spending time on eudaimonic aspects. They're spending time with their kids and whatnot. So I think there's an aspect to this that's important as well. That could be a policy directive, because again, that's a teachable skill, financial well-being.
Yeah, and I'll just say Angus Deaton always argued that it's better to ask people about, you know, do they have enough, rather than look at how much income they've got. So exactly the point Aaron's made, and you know, so from an economics angle, it's correct, I think. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Grimes and Dr. Jarden, for your insightful comments and feedbacks. Right. Okay. I guess time is now up. So I really wanted to invite I know a lot more comments and questions, but because of time, I would like to say this thing. So thank you so much, Professor Grimes and Aaron Jarden, for participating in this online session organized by Chiba University in connection to fairness and well-being. So of course, as you indicated in today's discussion, the linkage between fairness and well-being, how we define well-being and also fairness. Both of these terms are can be really abstract and then hard to define, as you were talking about. So, and I also have some concrete questions, but refrain from it because today I just want to MC. So thank you so much. We will definitely continue to clarify the definition, meaning, and linkage among these two very important concepts. So thank you so much. Today we cannot submit any concrete summary statement of what it's meant by that is fine. Let us continue to explore in our own ways, and then based on today's discussion, we would like to definitely come up with something in writing. That's our work. And then in the near future, we would like to ask you to kindly just browse through the document, and then that could be the basis of our future undertaking in the same vein. So would that be all right? And so thank you so much indeed for your excellent discussion and participation in today's 2-hour session. Multiple nationality people are engaged, and of course diverse issues can come in, but what we can say is that we have achieved something, right? We have that sense of subjective sense of achievement. I think while typing in, I was sort of engaged, engaged in this typing, and then what could be the linkage? Dr. Jarden is saying this one, but so how I can put it in Japanese. So of course I have knowns and unknowns, but it's okay. Let's keep on investigating. So that's how I feel. So thank you so much to both of you. Right. Okay. So please join me to give them a big hand of clapping, either by sound or by the graphical way. Right. Okay. So
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We wish to continue with our discussion in the same vein. So let us meet up when such an occasion comes up. So Professor Mizushima, thank you so much. Okay. Anything? Okay, so that's it from our session for today. So thank you so much, Professor Grimes and Dr. Jarden once again, and then everyone for your active participation. We will continue. So please watch out for it. Look out our website if you are continue to be interested. Thank you so much. About fairness, in the society. Okay, so that's it for today. So thank you so much. Okay, that's it. Bye-bye.